hi there. I didn't even see you. Well, how you guys doing today? Oh, good. I'm doing well. Thanks for asking. Well, if you're watching this, that means that I'm not here, obviously. But I did want to introduce you to somebody who's going to help run class today. Now, for some of you, this may be the first time you've met my friend. For others of you, you've probably met him before. That person is Digital Herrera. So let's say hi to Digital Herrera. Hi, everyone. That Digital Herrera. He's awesome. Anyway, so I've got to get going. I think that you are in very capable hands. I've got a big day planned for you. Big day, huge day. So let's get after it, and I will see you all on Tuesday. Have a great long weekend. Digital Herrera, take it over. Bye, regular Herrera. Have a great weekend. All right. Well, hey, let's get to work. Like regular Herrera said, we've got a big day today. So let's get started. Before we get going, you all know what has to happen. We need some jokes. So here we go. All right. So I needed to enlist some help from my guy, Digital Read.
Digital reading.
All right. First one. Why did the clock go to the dentist?
Because it was 2:30.
2:30. Oh, yeah, give me some. All right, here we go. Second joke. How does a train eat?
It goes choo-choo.
Woo! Give me some. Yeah. Okay. Last joke. First of all, Digital Read wants to show you his cool shirt. All right, Digital Read, here we go. Last joke. Last joke. Why? Oh, I forgot what it was. All right, last joke. Why couldn't the leopard play hide and seek?
Because it was always spotted.
Yeah! High five, Ben! Yeah! High five, Reed! All right, let's get going with class. Today in class, we are going to introduce Digital Herrera, which we've already done, tell some jokes, review Howard Taft, review Woodrow Wilson, watch a short video on the progressive presidents. Your homework for this weekend is to review for the test on Wednesday. So, we've already introduced Digital Herrera and told jokes. Let's get moving. Please open your ISN to the pages that have Taft and Wilson on them, and let's get started. All right, well, let's get started by reviewing the homework from last night. We're going to go over, discuss Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. So let's get going with Howard Taft. All right, so looking at William Howard Taft. Taft's personality was much different than TR's because he was quiet and cautious, whereas TR was much more outgoing and verbose and just very much more charismatic, whereas Taft didn't quite have or possess those characteristics. One of the reasons that Taft really made it to the big time was because he was part of Roosevelt's cabinet. Taft always wanted to be a Supreme Court justice, Chief Justice, and he kind of deferred his dream job to be on Roosevelt's cabinet. Once Teddy Roosevelt had made his promise that he wasn't going to run for office, he being TR, kind of handpicked Taft to be his successor. And because of TR's popularity, Taft won by a fair amount. As far as the reform programs went, Taft tried to continue some of TR's reform policies, but wasn't necessarily as successful. Part of that was because he didn't have the personality, but he also didn't really have the political will because he wasn't Roosevelt. People knew that, and he didn't embrace the concepts of progressivism and reform quite as much as TR did. Hey, knock it off over there. I see you. All right, let's get back to work. So looking at the next part, that's not to say that Taft didn't have an impact. He absolutely did. If we look at some of the numbers there, Taft brought more than 90 lawsuits against trusts, and he prosecuted trusts that limited trade. This makes a lot of sense because remember that Taft is a man of law, and so bringing all these lawsuits against these trusts would have been right up his alley, as opposed to trying to make these huge reforms. He did, however, make some reforms. He established the Children's Bureau in the Department of Labor, and really implemented the 8-hour workday for government employees. That's a big deal because with the growth of the government had become or would soon become the largest employer in all of America. He also added 2.7 million acres to the National Wildlife Refuge System. TR usually gets credit for starting that, but Taft definitely continued it. How Taft reformed the national government. Taft calls for reform of the banking system. Though Americans were divided on the proper solution, part of this is because some wanted the silver standard, some wanted the gold standard. Also, there was a big to-do about the federal bank and its establishment and the role that industrialists or capitalists should play in the National Bank of the United States. Bankers ended up having some power, but not all of the power. It's a kind of a checks and balance system that was created in a like image to the American Constitution. He also proposes the 16th Amendment, establishing a federal income tax, then passes the 17th Amendment, which calls for the direct election of senators. So when we look at how important this is, we see how people didn't really have a say and people didn't really able to make a difference. This direct election of senators is a very, very big deal because the election had happened in state legislatures, and in that case, it just promoted more government corruption and creating laws that were beneficial to the big businesses. And this 17th Amendment allows for a more true republic form of government. When I say republic, Republican form of government, I don't mean the political party. I mean republic like what Rome gave us, a representative democracy. And that's what the 17th Amendment does. All right, so there's your information on Howard Taft. I went ahead and pulled some digital strings and got another video that we can watch, just a short video. It has a little bit more information, some of the same, about Taft. So without further ado, I give you Howard Taft.
William Howard Taft was our nation's 27th president. When Teddy Roosevelt said goodbye to the White House, he left some pretty big shoes to fill. That could be why he handpicked William Howard Taft to follow in his footsteps. Tipping the scales at more than 330 pounds, Taft was our heaviest president and was known for being an all-around jovial man. Think Santa Claus, but in a darker suit.
Ho, ho, ho!
After all the work the popular Mr. Roosevelt did, Taft came into office thinking he could relax a little. Unfortunately, Taft got himself stuck in the White House bathtub and had to have a new tub built that was big enough to hold him. That meant it was also big enough to hold 4 regular-sized presidents.
Can you pass the soap, Richard?
Taft faced challenges that were larger than he was. People expected him to keep up Roosevelt's progressive social policies and fight big business. And when it came to trust busting, Taft put his weight into it.
A trust was a monopoly. It was like a telephone company that all the telephones belonged to it, so it could make you pay however much they wanted to, because if you wanted a telephone, there was no place else to go.
In the Progressive era, a trust was, well, not always to be trusted. They made it hard for the little guy to compete, and Progressives made a big deal about helping out the little guy. And Taft set out to finish the job that Teddy started. Standard Oil, Taft emptied their tank. American Tobacco, Taft crushed them. All in all, Taft filed up to 90 antitrust cases while he was president. But Taft wasn't all anti-business. He believed in dollar diplomacy and thought that loaning other countries lots of dollars would help them behave diplomatically. The president convinced American bankers that they'd make big bucks investing overseas in projects like a Chinese railway.
All aboard!
Taft, like Roosevelt, also did a lot to protect the great outdoors. He expanded national forest reserves and established more national parks. But no, he didn't take up hiking. And while becoming president is supposedly the top job in the nation, William Howard Taft had even bigger dreams. He wanted to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And in 1921, after he left the presidency, Taft's dream came true when he took the bench. Eventually, the former president even swore in a new president, Herbert Hoover, in 1929. Coming right after Roosevelt and right before World War I, Taft may not have been one of our biggest presidents, but he was definitely one of our Okay. You get the picture.
Well, hopefully that video helped. If it didn't, too bad. Okay, let's go on to Woodrow Wilson. All right, so we're looking in our ISNs at the Woodrow Wilson side of the page, and let's get after it. All right, so now we will direct our attention to Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was distinctly different than Taft and Roosevelt because he was really more an intellectual type. Wilson was a scholar and a historian. He had written a number of papers and books about the South and other things like that. One thing that often gets glossed over about Woodrow Wilson is how much of a racist he was. He actually published, prior to being president, quite a few papers kind of glorifying the Old South and the institution of slavery. And that was really, I think, in large part, something that doesn't get talked about enough in today's reflection on Woodrow Wilson. That's not to say that he didn't do good things. He did good things, but like we've talked about before, every president is flawed because they are a person. He just happened to have some really, really big flaws in so far as that he was an incredible racist, and I mean incredible, a lot of racist, not incredible like great or good. So his background, he was the governor of New Jersey. He also was a professor for a long time, and reform programs, the New Freedom, which gave more economic freedom to small businesses and average citizens. So this was obviously important to him, and it's some of the stuff that he pursued. Regarding industrialization, Wilson passing the Clayton Antitrust Act, which made it harder for trusts to form and exempted unions. Hey, you paying attention? Okay, good. Just checking. From antitrust laws, so that's important because anytime there's one union representing a group of people, like we've talked about the Bagger Union at like Jewel, that would technically be a monopoly or a trust. However, they got exemptions from this antitrust law, which allowed them to exist and work for the individual and for the collective bargaining. He also signed the Owen Child Labor Act and secured the 8-hour workday for railroad workers. Again, this 8-hour workday goes back to the concept that you have 8 hours to work, 8 hours to sleep, and 8 hours to do with what we will. Was the cry from the laborers. So 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and then 8 hours essentially for leisure, or getting your family together, or whatever you need to do. And that was during Wilson's tenure as president. He also, like his two predecessors, supported the creation of National Park Service and managed national parks for the preservation of public use. This was big because the environment had been getting stripped away through different mining practices, and these three progressive presidents really saw it as a political and moral imperative to preserve this land, a lot of the land, for future generations. Talking about how with Taft, the government being the biggest employer of American citizens, the government is also far and away in today's world, or in today's nation, the largest landowner. The United States owns a ton of land. A lot of it is out west, especially. So, hey, you still listening? What about you? And you? And you? And you? You all still listening? Good. Let's keep moving. How did each president reform the national government? So, Woodrow Wilson supports the Federal Reserve System, which was created in 1913. The Federal Reserve System essentially controls the flow of money from big banks to more rural banks, and from the national bank to the big banks in big cities like New York or Denver or Chicago or something like that, in order to try to prevent an economic depression like the one that had happened in the late 1800s. Also, during Wilson's presidency, the 16th Amendment was actually ratified. It started in the previous administration, but it actually was finished up here. So was the 17th Amendment. We already talked about that, about the direct election of senators. The 18th Amendment was the prohibition of alcohol. And then he also supported women's suffrage in the 19th Amendment. So this is probably, I would say, one of the biggest advances that Woodrow Wilson made as far as culture of the United States, was supporting women's suffrage. One thing I really want to make sure that we point out here is that suffrage, the term suffrage, sounds like suffering, but it is not suffering. Suffrage means to vote. So, while at first glance Wilson supporting women's suffrage might sound like Wilson is supporting women's suffering, it is not. It is Wilson is supporting women's right to vote through the 19th Amendment. So, let's take a look at a quick video that'll talk a little bit more about Woodrow Wilson and his time in office. Okay, so there's Woodrow Wilson. Again, I pulled another video, so let's go ahead and take a look at that. And it's a short one, so I'll see you in a few.
Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States. He's best known for navigating the country through the First World War. He was born on December 28, 1856, in Stanton, Virginia, to a family with strong Christian and Confederate roots. One of his earliest memories was seeing General Robert E. Lee pass by on horseback. Despite early academic struggles, Wilson thrived at Princeton, where he would become university president in 1902. Following a prestigious career in academia, Wilson won the governorship of New Jersey in 1910. But Wilson soon set his sights on a higher prize, the White House. In 1912, he triumphed in shocking fashion after the conservative incumbent William Howard Taft split the Republican vote with Bull Moose candidate Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson became only the second Democratic president since the Civil War. Wilson's early foreign policy focused on maintaining American neutrality amid World War I, a position that secured his re-election in 1916. But increasing German aggression, which climaxed in 128 American deaths aboard the sunken Lusitania, pressured Wilson and the U.S. to enter the fray. In 1917, Wilson persuaded Congress to declare war. The reinvigorated Allies achieved victory just a year later. Wilson was a key diplomatic voice following the 1918 armistice. In his famous 14-point speech, issued on January 8, 1918, he proposed the League of Nations, a global alliance that preceded the United Nations. For his efforts, he received the 1920 Nobel Peace Prize. On the domestic front, Wilson enacted sweeping labor reform and pushed for the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. His views on race, however, were not so progressive. He backed segregation and endorsed the controversial film The Birth of a Nation that lionized the Ku Klux Klan. Wilson was also noted for opposing prohibition. He correctly thought it would be unenforceable, but he was unable to prevent its official ratification in 1919. Late in his second term, Wilson suffered multiple debilitating strokes. With the president bedridden and partially paralyzed, his cabinet and his wife Edith secretly carried out most of his duties. Wilson's poor health continued after he left office in 1921. He died on February 3, 1924.
All right, so hopefully all that made sense. If it didn't, don't worry. I have one more thing for you. I pulled another digital string. Yeah, that's right. One of my favorite digital social studies teachers besides myself. My good friend, John Green.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to finish our discussion of progressivism and indulge in a bit of great man history. Mr. Green, great man history, huh? Well, I was born on a sunny summer morning in 1976. Yeah, you're not that great, me from the past. Also, you're a boy, not a man, and the only historically significant thing you ever participated in was a brilliant senior prank that wasn't even your idea. However, 39 of our 43 presidents were at least arguably great men, and today we'll be talking about 3 of them. It will be kind of like a Jefferson versus Hamilton for the 20th century, except not like that at all. But there will be a canal, and 2 people get shot. So as we saw in Crash Course World History, national governments were on the rise from the middle of the 19th century until basically now. And in the US, corporations became national, and then by the 20th century, international. Like the British East India Company was kind of an international corporation, but it wasn't the same as Coca-Cola, although they did both deal in narcotics. And this mania for nationalization even affected sports. Like in baseball, the National League and the American League were formed, and in 1903, they played the first inaccurately named World Series. I'm sorry, was Botswana invited? Then it's not a World Series. Anyway, the rise of a strong national government was seen as an alternative to people's lives being controlled by provincial, city, and state governments or by ever-growing corporations. Like Herbert Crowley, editor of the New Republic, thought that to achieve the Jeffersonian democratic self-determination ideal of individual freedom, the country needed to employ Hamiltonian government intervention in the economy, and he wasn't the only one who believed that. Okay, so in 1901, 42-year-old Theodore Roosevelt became the youngest American president ever after William McKinley was assassinated by Leon Skolzgis. Hold on.
Czolgosz, Polish.
Czolgosz? His name was Leon Chuckles? Man, Leon Chuckles was a real barrel of laughs for an anarchist. Usually they're very serious. Right, so Leon Chuckles paved the way for Teddy Roosevelt, who in many ways was the model of the 20th century president. He was very engaged in both domestic and foreign policy, and he set the political agenda for the whole country. His political program, the Square Deal, aimed to distinguish good corporations that provided useful products and services at fair prices from evil corporations that existed just to make money. That is hilarious. A corporation that doesn't exist just to make money. That's fantastic, Teddy. Everybody knows that corporations are just inherently greedy people, but they are people. Roosevelt felt it was the federal government's responsibility to regulate the economy directly and to break up power of wealthy corporations, and to use the Sherman Act to prosecute bad trusts, such as the Northern Securities Company, which was a holding company created by J.P. Morgan that directed 3 major railroads and monopolized transport. And that did not make J.P. Morgan a happy bunny. Thank you for that, Stan. That's wonderful. Shockingly, the legislative and executive branches managed to work together, and Congress passed some actual legislation, including the Hepburn Act of 1906, which gave the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate railroad rates and examine their company books. And Roosevelt was also a conservationist. He wanted to preserve the environment from economic exploitation, probably so that there would be plenty of animals for him to hunt with his big stick while he walked softly. Having appointed noted progressive Gifford Pinchot head of the Forest Service, millions of acres were set aside for new, highly managed national parks, reflecting the progressive idea that experts could manage the world. But then in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt decided to go elephant hunting instead of running for re-election, and he picked William Howard Taft to be his successor. But the man who became our largest president massively disappointed Roosevelt. When I say our largest, by the way, I don't mean our greatest. I mean our largest. Taft was a pretty hardcore trust buster who ordered the prosecution that broke up Standard Oil in 1911, but he didn't see big business as bad unless the corporations stifled competition. He also supported the 16th Amendment, allowing Congress to pass an income tax, and that paved the way for the 18th Amendment, prohibition, because with an income tax, the federal government didn't have to rely on liquor excise taxes. So why didn't Roosevelt like Taft? Well, not only was Taft more conservative than most progressives, he also fired Pinchot in 1910, and Roosevelt was so frustrated with Taft that he actually challenged the incumbent president for the Republican nomination in 1912, which Roosevelt lost, but he didn't let it drop. He founded his own progressive party called the Bull Moose Party so that he could run again. So the election of 1912 featured 4 candidates: Taft, Teddy Roosevelt for the Bull Moose Party, Eugene Debs for the Socialist Party, and Democrat Woodrow Wilson. It's worth noting that in contemporary American political discourse, all 4 of these people would have been seen as somewhere between crazy liberals and actual communists. So Eugene Debs, from right here in my home state of Indiana, did not support the Socialist Party's goal of abolishing capitalism, but he ran on a platform that included public ownership of railroads and banks and laws limiting work hours. And running on the socialist ticket, Debs won 6% of the vote, which was, to quote another president, not bad. But the election of 1912 turned out to be a contest between Wilson and Roosevelt's competing views over the dangers of increasing government power and economic concentration. Wilson claimed freedom today is something more than being let alone. The program of government must in these days be positive, not negative merely. That's just not good grammar, sir. His program, called New Freedom, was supposed to reinvigorate democracy by restoring market competition and preventing big business from dominating government. It included stronger antitrust laws and policies to encourage small businesses. Roosevelt's answer to New Freedom was a program he called New Nationalism, because of course in election years, all things are new. Roosevelt recognized the inevitability of big business and hoped to use government intervention to stop its abuses. New Nationalism included heavy taxes on personal and corporate fortunes and greater federal regulation of industry. So the Bull Moose Party platform was in some ways a vision of a modern welfare state. It called for women's suffrage, federal regulation, national labor and health legislation for women and children, 8-hour days and living wage for all workers, national systems of social insurance for health, unemployment, and old age. What are we, Canada? God, I wish we were Canada. You weren't recording that, were you, Stan? Roosevelt thought his party's platform was one of the most important documents in the history of mankind, and Americans agreed. They supported him and elected him in a landslide. Oh, wait, no, they didn't. Instead, he lost, and also a guy shot him at one of his campaign stops. That's shooting number 2. Roosevelt, however, survived and even went on to make the speech after being shot. What happened in the election is that Taft and Roosevelt split the Republican vote, leaving Woodrow Wilson president with a mere 42% of the popular vote, giving us our only Democratic president between 1896 and 1932. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document. If I'm wrong, I get shocked by the shock pen, which many of you insist is fictional, but I promise, it's not. The 2 things we are fighting against, namely excessive tariffs and almost universal monopoly, are the very things that these 2 branches of the Republican Party both decline to combat. They intend to accept these evils and stagger along under the burden of excessive tariffs and intolerable monopolies as best they can through administrative commissions. I say, therefore, that it is inconceivable that that the people of the United States, whose instinct is against special privilege and whose deepest convictions are against monopoly, should turn to either of these parties for relief when these parties do not so much as pretend to offer them relief. All right, it's definitely about the 1912 election. Talks about the Republican Party being split into two parts, so it's by a Democrat or a socialist, but probably a Democrat, judging from the mystery document itself. You always make it hard, Stan, so it's not going to be Woodrow Wilson because that would be obvious, but I do not know the names of any other prominent Democrats, so I am going to guess Woodrow Wilson. Yes! Get in! So with its stirring anti-tariff, anti-monopoly, do not pass go, do not collect $200 stance, New Freedom won out. And because the Democrats also controlled Congress, Wilson was able to implement this program. The Underwood Tariff reduced import duties, and after the ratification of the 16th Amendment, Congress imposed a graduated income tax on the richest 5% of Americans. Other legislation included the Clayton Act of 1914, which exempted unions from antitrust laws and made it easier for them to strike, the Keating-Owen Act, which outlawed child labor in manufacturing, and the Adamson Act, which mandated an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. If Wilson's New Freedom sounds a lot like Roosevelt's New Nationalism, that's because they ended up being pretty similar. Wilson engaged in less trust-busting than expected and more regulation of the economy. Wilson didn't institute a national system of health and unemployment insurance, but he did expand the powers of the Federal Trade Commission to investigate and prohibit unfair monopolistic practices. He also supported the founding of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, which gave the government much more control over banks in response to the Panic of 1907, where the U.S. had to be bailed out by J.P. Morgan. Fear not, big banks. The government will bail you out in due time. So under Roosevelt and Wilson, and to a lesser extent Taft, progressivism flourished domestically, but it also became an international phenomenon as presidents expanded national government power outside the country's border, mostly in the Western Hemisphere. Like between 1901 and 1920, U.S. Marines landed in Caribbean countries over 20 times, usually to create a more friendly environment for American businesses, but sometimes just to hang out on the beach. And this points to an interesting contradiction. Progressive presidents were very concerned about big business as a threat to freedom in the United States, but in Latin America and the Caribbean, they weren't that concerned about freedom at all. Teddy Roosevelt especially was much more active in international diplomacy than his predecessors. He was the first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize, for instance, for helping to negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. You may be familiar with his motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," which essentially meant the U.S. will intervene in Latin America whenever we want. And probably the most famous such intervention was the building of the Panama Canal. It featured feats of engineering and succeeding where the French had failed. Stan, these are my favorite things. Let's go to the thought bubble. The way we got the 10-mile-wide canal zone wasn't so awesome. In 1903, Panama was part of Colombia, but the U.S. encouraged Felipe Benalveria to lead an uprising. Benalveria, a representative of the Panama Canal Company, was so grateful after the U.S. sent a gunboat to ensure that the Colombian army couldn't stop him that he signed a treaty giving the U.S. the right to build and operate the canal and sovereignty over newly independent Panama's canal zone, which we gave up in 2000 after enjoying nearly 100 years of sovereignty thanks to Jimmy Carter's stupid altruism. Roosevelt also added the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, the 1823 statement that the U.S. would defend independent Latin American states from European intervention. Now, according to Roosevelt, we would wield our big stick like a policeman waving around a nightstick exercising an international police power over the Western Hemisphere. In practice, this meant using American troops to ensure that Latin American countries were stable enough for Americans to invest there. Like in 1904, we seized the Customs House in the Dominican Republic to make sure that they paid their debts to investors. Then, by executive agreement, American banks got control of the DR's finances. Roosevelt also encouraged investment by the United Fruit Company in Honduras and Costa Rica, helping to turn those nations into banana republics. No, not the store thought bubble. Yes. Taft, on the other hand, maybe because of his experiences as governor of the Philippines, was less eager to wave America's big stick. He emphasized loans and economic investment as the best way to spread American influence in a policy that came to be known as dollar diplomacy. Ultimately, dollar diplomacy was probably more effective, but it seemed weak to many people in contrast to Roosevelt's strategy of send all the troops right now! Thanks, Thought Bubble. I wore my Banana Republic shirt just for this occasion. So we've discussed Roosevelt and Taft's foreign policy. Let's move on to Wilson, who was, of course, an isolationist. No, Woodrow Wilson, okay. Woodrow Wilson was not a volleyball. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, a former American history professor, and once had been governor of New Jersey, so he understood moral indecency. Wilson thought the best way to teach other countries about the greatness of America was to export colossal amounts of American products. Like in 1916, he instructed a group of businessmen, sell goods that will make the world more comfortable and happy and convert them to the principles of America. In short, Woodrow Wilson believed correctly that the essence of democracy is the freedom to choose among hundreds of brightly colored breakfast cereals. Still, Wilson intervened in Latin America more than any other U.S. president, and his greatest moral triumph was in Mexico, where he wanted to teach the Mexicans, quote, to elect good men. To do this, Wilson sent troops to stop weapons from flowing to the military dictator Victoriano Huerta, but the Americans who landed at Veracruz were not welcomed with open arms, and 100 Mexicans and 19 Americans were killed. And then in 1916, having learned his lesson, just kidding, Wilson sent 10,000 troops into northern Mexico to chase after revolutionary bandit Pancho Villa. Villa had killed 17 Americans in New Mexico, and everyone knows that the proper response to such a criminal act is to send 10,000 troops into a foreign country. Pershing's expedition was a smashing success, fortunately, except that he actually did not capture Pancho Villa. But all of that was a prelude to Wilson's leading America to our first international moral crusade, our involvement in the Great War. So this period of American history is important because Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson oversaw the expansion of the power of the federal government, both at home and abroad, and in doing so, they became the first modern American presidents. I mean, these days we might talk about small government and large government, but really, we're always talking about large government. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson recognized that the national government was going to have to deal with big business, and that it would have to get big to do that, and also that it had a role to play in ensuring that Americans would retain some freedom in this new industrial era. And they also built neo-imperialistic foreign policies around the idea that the safer the world was for American business, the better it was for Americans. As our old friend Eric Foner wrote, the presidents who spoke the most about freedom were likely to intervene most frequently in the affairs of other countries. Sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. We'll see an extreme and ambiguous case of that next week when we look at America in World War I. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The associate producer is Danica Johnson. Our show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul Meyer, Rosiana Rojas, and myself, and our graphics team is Thought Cafe. Every week there's a new caption for the Libertage. If you'd like to suggest one, you can do so in comments, where you can also ask questions about today's video that will be answered by our team of historians. Thanks for watching Crash Course, and as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be awesome.
Whoa, it is hard to match how quickly he talks and the production value that is given in Crash Course history. Hopefully that helped. Again, if not, deal with it. All right, well, that's all I've got for you now. Don't forget, your test is on Wednesday. We don't have school on Monday. We're reviewing on Tuesday. So your homework over the weekend is to review for the test. So I'll see you guys later, and have a great weekend.
Oh,